Hello, my name is Thomas Steinmauer. I'm the product manager of the Log Manager series and FP TraceManager at Upscene Productions. This is another screencast discussing the FP TraceManager product. We had been releasing version 3 of this product a few months ago, and it is running successfully in a lot of countries now. We already created a screencast on the new version, basically showing the new features from a high-level perspective. What we want to do in this screencast now is exclusively discussing the hotspots analysis feature, because in our impression that's one of the most useful thing in version 3, what we hear from the customers and what we use ourselves. So let's see what hotspots analysis in version 3 in the Enterprise Edition does for you. So what is a hotspot view from a technical perspective? From a technical perspective, it is trace data is received in FP TraceManager. It is shown in a parsed way. What the hotspot view now does is it offers an in-memory on-the-fly aggregation of executed statements, stored procedures, and triggers per database. So that's the technical perspective. The major use cases, the major business use cases are the top contributors and some sort of problem pattern identification. So what does top contributors mean? You probably want to know per SQL statement or per stored procedure or per trigger what was the total execution count of a particular SQL statement or a particular stored procedure. The same goes, what was the execution time? So what was the total execution time across all executions of the same SQL statement? What was the prepare time? The total prepare time, or the minimum, maximum, or average. So what was the number of total records fetched for a query? So you can identify queries which fetches a lot of records, and you might ask yourself if it is necessary at all, or perhaps you have some sort of fetch all properties set to true in your client access components. The same goes for I/O statistics or for some sort of Firebird page cache statistics. You pretty much want to cut down per statement, per stored procedure, per trigger. What are some sort of I/O statistics? So how many reads from disk in average? Or is there a great difference between the minimum and the maximum reads from disk, and so on. So there's a lot of things here which are important when talking about top contributors in your database. A different area is the hotspots analysis feature can be used some sort of problem pattern identification. So, for instance, in your client application, if you're explicitly using prepared statement, which is a good thing, but if, for instance, you are re-preparing the same statement over and over again and execute it and so on, this one is probably not the best idea. For instance, if you're batch inserting something, you might want to prepare the SQL statement outside the loop and execute the statement inside the loop then. So basically it can be used, for instance, if the number of preparations is getting closer or is even equal to the number of executions for one and the same statement. This might be a sign that you're preparing this statement too many times in comparison to the number of executions. The same goes for transactions. Transaction management is one of the Most important thing besides SQL performance in your client application. So again, you can identify a problem pattern if the number of transactions for one and the same statement in comparison to the number of executions is gonna be equal, which could mean that you're running the statement in some sort of auto-commit mode, so without using explicit transactions, or you have some sort of bug in your client application and starting a transaction every time in a for loop, for instance, before executing the statement and so on. Another interesting and important thing is when you're monitoring your top contributors is did the execution plan of the same statement change over time? It could change because of the data volume changed. It could be that an index has been dropped, which previously was available or something like that. So you might have an eye on that as well. And it could also be interesting if you have pretty much the same database from a structure perspective in a dev environment, QA, production environment, and you run the same SQL statement and want to see if it behaves the same way in different databases or if it behaves differently. It could be, again, a reason that indexes are missing in one and the other database and so on. So that's another problem pattern which could be useful for you, and the hotspots analysis gives you a quick answer on that and much more. So let's move to a live demo here now. You probably already know the FP TraceManager product a bit. So what you basically have to do is you have to define a project with the trace configuration and so on. What we're gonna do for our hotspots analysis demo here is now we duplicate an existing project and the important thing here is to get meaningful data out of the hotspot analysis view, which we will see later on, is to use the right trace configuration parameters here in that area. Version 3 has something new called templates with some pre-installed, and there is one called hotspots analysis. So just simply pick this one here, and it gives you the most important things or the most useful things when talking about the hotspots analysis feature. What we also want to do is to define a database filter. So basically we'll see later on how the hotspots view looks like when running the same statement on two different databases, and I'm using a wildcard for a regular expression here. So let's finish this one here and run it. So I've prepared a small demo application where we can produce some, run some statements here. Let's start with an easy one. So it's a prepared insert into statement, inserting 100 records in a single transaction with a sequential value assigned as parameter. So if we're gonna insert this one here, we will see that the continuous past trace data is coming along here. It gets visualized, and there's a new tab here called hotspots, divided into statement hotspot, procedure hotspot, and trigger hotspot. So if we switch to the statement hotspot and we click refresh, we will see there is basically one SQL statement executed. It is the insert into statement for a particular database. And the interesting things are starting here now. Let's rearrange those counters a bit. So we're gonna move this one here up, this one here as well. Then we want to diff the diff column here as well. So okay. So what we see here, that the SQL statement, you could get this a similar information here as well with using the footer band and the aggregate functions here, but it's much easier now with the hotspots analysis because it basically tells us the execution count was 100 times. It has been first executed at this time stamp, and it has been last executed in this time stamp. So it has been run once, so those are equal. What we also see here is that we're gonna move this one here a bit forward and this one here as well. We see here that the SQL statement has prepared once and executed 100 times. So it's usually a good sign because it hasn't been re-prepared every time before executing the statement. So that's already a problem pattern you can easily identify here. Another one here is, for instance, the 100 executions have been issued in one distinct transaction. So what we get here in the transactions info column is the transaction ID. So it's the transaction ID. So let's run this one again. Now, not in a single transaction, but in a transaction per execution. If we go back here, we will see that the number of transactions goes up equal to the number of the last 100 executions. So that's another problem pattern you can identify here. All right. We will see that later on, the execution plan change. So let's go back to the top contributors here. Well, the top contributors, we have already seen the execution count. What you might be interested in is the prepare total time as well, because especially on large tables, prepare time can be significant. So especially in that case, it might make sense to prepare a statement once and reuse it every time. You're gonna also see what was the average execution time, what was the minimum, the maximum, and so on. So those, you have different ways to how to define your top contributors. Is it the total execution count or the average execution time, and so on. Alright, run disconnect and run the same thing now on a different database. We will see that there is a second row now, which basically shows us that the same statement has been running in a different database. So the aggregation key here, what you see here is the SQL statement combined with the database name. And here you can, for instance, compare manually here now what was the execution count, for instance, what was the remote address, so what client machines, client hosts have been accessing the database. What we also see is has the SQL statement been running in different isolation modes, for instance, and so on. Here we see the different counters, the number of reads, the writes, so the I/O statistics, the average, minimum, maximum, and so on. So now let's see what happens if we don't if we run a non-prepared query, so basically this means the SQL statement is concatenated by string concatenation. And if we are reusing the same value here, single transaction, this is fine, and we go back and click refresh, we're gonna see it is this one here now, that it has been executed 100 times, the same statement, and it also got prepared 100 times. So there might be space for improvements to switch over that to a prepared statement. If we're gonna do the string concatenation scenario here with the sequential values, we will see that it somehow gets larger now, because if you string concatenate, it's basically a different SQL statement which results in its dedicated row in the Hotspots analysis view. If we run that as a stored procedure here, again, for instance, as a prepared statement, there is an additional column tab here called procedure hotspot. So what we see here now is that's an aggregation on the procedure name and database name again. So if we're gonna run that on the second database again, and for instance here again, we will see a different aggregation here now. So especially in the trigger hotspot, as well as we are having an auto increment trigger here behind the scene, especially if you have your database a lot of business logic in server-side code, the hotspots analysis view helps you out here as well. Alright, another one here is, let's start from scratch here in a new trace session. For instance, the use case where we are executing a select and fetching queries. So for instance, we want to execute a SQL statement, a query once with other var class, so basically fetching all rows, and we run this one here. It can take a while, and we're gonna see two statements here. This one here is executed behind the scene, but this is pretty much what we want to investigate. So you can sort by different, however you define your top contributors. It can be the reads total from disk. It can be the total execution time you're interested in. But for instance, so our query which is fetching records, a lot of fetching records, this one here might be interesting. So there's a records fetch total, minimum, maximum, and average. So this one allows you to inspect how many records are fetched, and you might reduce the number of records fetched in the client application. Perhaps it doesn't make sense to use to do a select star from the table and fetching all records for your particular business use case. All right. What we haven't seen now is how the execution plan can change. Let's start over something different now, connect to a database which is part of the trace session. And now let's see if we have any index here. Yes, we do. So if we run, for instance, select star from T1 where a int is some value, we will see that the execution plan is using the index. So it's showing that the index is used. If we switch back to FB TraceManager and we're gonna refresh this one here, we'll see this statement here. So if we have a look, and probably we want to move that a bit up, let's see. Let's see. This is over here. Well, we can scroll to the right side here. There is a column called execution plans, so the number of execution plans, the number of distinct execution plans, that's the important thing. And we can say view execution plans info, and we can see that this is the execution plan chosen when executing the statement. So if we want to do that without an index, for instance, we could deactivate the index. It takes longer. The index is not used, so if we switch back, here now is. We also see the old index DDL statement. But the same statement which we executed has been now executed 2 times. The total execution time is over 1 second. We will see that, for instance, the minimum was 19 milliseconds, the maximum was above 1 second. So we will see already that there is some sort of difference here. So what you might do in that case is to have a look on the execution plans, the number of different execution plans here. And what you see here is that we have a value of 2 now. And if we have another view on the execution plans info, we will see that there are 2 different execution plans used when executing the same statement, and the last one is always on top of that list. So that could be very useful for certain scenarios, and to see if an execution plan for the same statement changes over time. You will also see the difference here now is that the minimum reads from disks can be quite different to the maximum and so on, which could be related to caching as well. But it's an indication that there could be something wrong. Alright, so that's for statement. For procedures, we haven't any procedures here now, as we only executed a query here. But I think you might get the idea how powerful the hotspots analysis feature is. While you could invest some time in investigating the parsed trace data in that grid here, it's much easier now with the hotspots analysis view here per trace session. So to summarize, the whole thing is the hotspots analysis view with its in-memory on-the-fly aggregation data structure per database allows you to identify your top contributors. Whatever you define yourself as a top contributor, be it a total execution time or an average execution time or the number of total executions and so on. And it also can be used for some kind of manual problem pattern identification. Currently manually, we might improve the product in a way to run some sort of analysis over the hotspots analysis view and point you out some predefined problem patterns we think which are useful. Alright, so hotspots analysis feature is new in version 3 and it is part of the Enterprise Edition. I hope you enjoyed the screencast and found it useful. So, well, thanks for watching.